All right. I think everything's loaded up all right here. I need to do a better job of keeping the now practicing part updated whenever I'm focusing on different things for these jam streams. So I'm going to try and make a point of doing that today. That way people who are just jumping in will know exactly what we're covering. So let's start with intro, warm up. All right. I think all of the stream stuff is good. Like I usually do when we get started for streams here, I will be doing pulse checks on the audio quality. For the stream itself, I dropped my bitrate back down to what I've been using for streams here on YouTube. Hopefully there's no issues with the quality going in and out, but considering it's just going to be me here interacting with the chat, there shouldn't be any issue for the stream to lag or for the footage to get choppy. But we'll go ahead and get started. So to kick off the jam stream, this would be number 3, I believe. And for those that may be new, tuning into the jam stream here, the point of these is to serve a couple different purposes. One, this is a chance to be sort of an informal practice session for beatbox and beatbox technique. I've mentioned a couple times, but in case you're new to the channel or any of my content, in addition to the gaming and art related stuff here on YouTube, I'm also a beatboxer. And so the jam streams are a way for me to work on practicing material, basics, techniques, and also do a little bit of explanation for some of the sounds and sound technique that goes into beatboxing. And what I usually start off with on these sessions is an overview of warm-ups and real basic preparation stuff when it comes to getting ready to either go in for an extended practice session for beatboxing, or if you're on the competitive stage and looking at potentially going into a battle. I think the idea of warm-ups and warm-up technique could apply to any of those scenarios. So that's usually what we start off with. And for today, I'm planning on doing some more pattern practice, some drills, kind of building off of what we've talked about in the last couple jam streams with the basic pattern practice. I've got a couple ideas on how to mix things up a little bit. And then sprinkled in between the practice and drills, I'm planning on doing some more sound technique analysis. The point of these jam sessions isn't primarily to be a tutorial or a learning resource for people that want to get into beatboxing, but because folks that might be tuning in might be curious about the techniques or whatever it is goes into beatbox technique, whenever I incorporate sounds or I feel like there's a noteworthy sound I want to talk about, I'll usually stop in between the pattern practice to explain the technique, where the sound comes from, and how it works. And if people are really interested on learning the mechanics and the real in-depth nuts and bolts for technique and how to do some of the more advanced stuff, then I'll usually point people to resources out within the beatbox community that's going to give a bit more of an in-depth and hands-on type of tutorial approach than I can give in this particular format. And so what I have prepared here today, just like I did last time, and I started doing this in the second jam stream, I'm going to try and do this every time just to be consistent. I have my soundless Excel document here, and this is helping me sort of remember, one, what I talked about before, and two, what I want to talk about for each session. And so I'm going to be referring to this particular sound list for a couple things that I wanted to talk about in the session today. And there's going to be a mix of some basic sounds. Let's see. I do want to talk a little bit about some snare technique. And I'll have to take a look at some of the later stuff on the list. I don't really have much in the way of new technicality things I wanted to share. I think it's going to be just a bit more of doing practice and varying drills when it comes to technicality patterns. And then sort of sprinkled in between will be additional work on basses and applying the different basses sort of situationally. Last time on the jam stream, we walked through the process of routine construction, and I hadn't really planned out anything in advance for working on routine construction, but if we get further along in the stream and some ideas come together, I've no problem sort of diverting if we have some ideas that we could put together. But we'll go ahead and start from the beginning. So like I mentioned before, the importance of warm-ups when it comes to beatboxing is pretty important when it comes to just being prepared if you're put on the spot. If you know you're going to be going into an event or a competition or something planned and you know you're going to be beatboxing, usually you can sort of plan out how you want to warm up beforehand. But like I talked about in the previous stream, the example that I gave would be if just somebody randomly came up to you and put you on the spot and asked you to bust out a routine or something beatbox related really quickly. Your ability to do the real kind of complex or crazy stuff is not necessarily going to be as sharp when you're completely cold. And so warm-up techniques and patterns and routines and whatnot are all meant to give you a real quick chance to prepare, get your face warmed up, and be ready to go and go out full force when you actually want to perform or whatever. And so in the previous stream, I talked a bit about some basic pattern stuff for warming up the face muscles. And one thing I didn't talk about that I did learn from a well-known beatboxer in the scene that I've mentioned a couple times, a guy from the States named Kindo, and he talked about the importance of breathing. And breathing is not necessarily restricted to just warm-ups, but it kind of has to tie into beatboxing in general. And so what does that mean? I'm not going to go through any exercises here. I just wanted to sort of hit on this as something important that I definitely agree with after hearing his explanation. So as you can imagine, beatboxing is primarily driven by the power of your lungs and air, and quite a few of the techniques and things that you do in beatboxing center around air control. So what that means is you have to be able to regulate how much air you're expelling out and taking in so that you're not running out of air and getting gassed in the middle of trying to do a pattern or what have you. And part of that is practice, but there are some other techniques that Kindo had mentioned that can sort of help condition your lungs. If let's say you're completely new to beatboxing and you don't have a musical background, some really easy exercises that he talked about are just simple breathing exercises, doing things like doing a counted number of sort of beats or beats in a measure and breathing in and then breathing out in that sort of metered, controlled fashion, and then just getting in the habit of taking in more air, filling your lungs, and then breathing out, and then regulating that, and doing that over and over again conditions your lungs to basically up their capacity and make them stronger and more used to variations in airflow. And I do think that's important. I try and do that every once in a while just as a way to keep up the conditioning. It's kind of similar, I think, to people who sing or people who play a wind musical instrument. If you sing or play a musical instrument, again, those are two types of music that are primarily fueled by your lungs and your air, and also to some extent your breath support with like your diaphragm and everything else supporting the force you're pushing out. But you have to be able to control how much air you're breathing out and breathing in when you're playing an instrument or singing. And that's just practice over time and conditioning. And beatboxing is the same way. A lot of the pros out there, whenever they're teaching people, they talk a lot about mentally planning out how you're going to be constructing patterns and sort of structuring your breathing, as it were. And so that's a little bit tricky to sort of explain to someone who's never beatboxed before. But if we think about it practically, you are essentially a percussion person whenever you're putting together beatbox patterns. You're kind of like a drum set with all sorts of different instruments and tools at your disposal. But if you think of it more like a percussionist who's has to breathe as opposed to just a person who's, hitting things with their hands, I think that sort of helps in giving you a mental map of how you want to do things when it comes to figuring out where to breathe. Because if you have a lot of air power in your lungs and you can go for an extended amount of time without breathing, that's one thing. But in beatboxing, one of the challenges is the fact that different techniques and different sounds and different combinations of sounds use your air differently than others. And so what do I mean by that? What I mean by that is if you are doing a real simple beat, and this will be sort of our warm-up before we do the actual warm-up drills. This is something I wanted to talk about just to sort of get the theory out there. So if you're looking at a simple pattern in beatboxing, let's just say snares, hats, kicks. So something like a it's a real simple beat like that. It's pretty moderate tempo, not very complex, and you can sort of mentally plan to breathe in between sections of the rhythm that are repeating. And so it's not really a difficult place to think, okay, if I've got the and you do that, let's say 5 times, you can get a breath in after the end of that rhythm. You don't have to worry about breathing in between the hat or the snare or the kick or whatnot. It's pretty regulated. But the idea of more complex sounds or techniques doesn't necessarily give you that predictable freedom when it comes to where I'm going to be stopping to breathe in a pattern. So a more complicated example would be if you are doing a bunch of technicality patterns in between your beats, which is going to change the flow and the rhythm and also the way your air is being consumed. So if we take our original sample beat, just the and we added, let's just say we added some double kicks and maybe a couple extra hat related sounds. So now we get something like now it's not necessarily as metered because you have a lot more going on in between the different sections of your rhythm. So in that case, it becomes a little more challenging of, okay, do I need to add in sort of a fill or a technical pattern to break up the repetition in the rhythm? Or do I want to try and squeeze in a breath after I finish the final snare in the set? And that's where the whole balancing act of figuring out where to breathe comes in. Because if you don't, and you just keep doing the beat over and over again, eventually you'll run out of air and you'll have to take a breath. So the challenge comes from planning out the rhythm in your head and then making sure you give yourself options to breathe and sort of reset your lungs so that you can keep going to do whatever it is you're doing. And I haven't really come up with a concrete methodology for how to do that. You sort of have to feel it out and play with the ideas of how you want your rhythms to go. But one thing that I do, and I don't know if this is common or considered standard technique in beatboxing, but if we take our original beat, and let's say we're mixing it up, but there's going to be a section where we know we're going to need to breathe. You could add something like a fill or a set of technical sounds at the end as a transitional period and give yourself a chance to breathe before going into the next either repetition or iteration of the beat. So what does that mean? So if we were going, let's do the more complicated one with the double kicks and whatnot, which is and so the additional technical part that I added at the end sort of gives you the opportunity to fit a breath in somewhere in that pattern, because you're essentially taking a half or eighth beat rest in between all the other sounds, and then it gives you a chance to get the air in and then go into whatever you're going to do next. If you're going to repeat the same rhythm or switch it up, add sounds, what have you. And so that's the challenge of sort of the regulation of air is when you look at beatboxing resources, your lungs, and then your time within whatever it is you're doing, how you're going to give yourself time to breathe. And to go back to the whole reason why I'm mentioning this, the idea of doing breathing drills and just getting your lungs conditioned to, one, take in more air, and two, to be able to regulate how much air you're using, is overall going to improve your ability when it comes to beatboxing. It's something I think everybody needs to work on. It's definitely something I need to work on, because the more you do that, the more control you'll have when it comes to putting different sounds together and performing, as it were. So with that said, let's go ahead and get warmed up. I do want to run through sort of our standard drills and reinforce some of the basics that we talked about before. So we talked about the lip oscillation, simple patterns that help get blood flow into your face and get your face muscles warmed up. So when you're doing more advanced things like your BMGs, you get that blood circulation that's more controlled and you're not going in cold. So I'm going to do just sort of a mix of lip oscillation drills and some snares just as a sort of warm up and practice. And I'm going to also use that as an opportunity to sort of work in basic drills. It'll be kind of a twofold thing. And then from there, I'll probably start mixing up the patterns a little bit. And then there are some sounds that I wanted to talk about. So we'll sort of proceed in order. Just in case people watching this were wondering, when I get ready to do these streams, I don't write out any material or outlines for what I want to talk about. I basically sort of mentally come up with a list of ideas or things I want to cover in the jam stream, and then how it actually unfolds just depends on where it goes. It's not meant to be a really rigidly structured thing. It's more of an open-ended practice session and an opportunity to talk a little bit about beatbox technique for those that are curious. So we can go ahead and get started. I'm just going to work on some practice drills, and we'll see as people sort of come and go what I want to focus on. Let's go ahead and get started. Switch. switch. At some point when I'm doing these, I should try and do like a how long can I do a continuous beat for before I have to take a break and stop. That could be a fun thing to do. It's like a challenge. But real quickly, as we're sort of transitioning through the warm-ups and the different drills, I did hit on the first sound that I wanted to talk a little bit about because I didn't mention it on any of the previous streams, and it's not necessarily the most integral or complex sound, but it is useful just to have in your arsenal, and it's not too difficult to learn. And that's called the tennis pop. That's the most consistent term that I've found for it. But that's a... And I think most people have probably done a variation of the sound at some point because it's really just a hollowed out version of just a regular pop. Like if you just sort of close your mouth and put your lips together and then forcefully make a popping sound outwards with your air. That's how you get a... And that's just a regular pop in beatboxing terms. And it's not necessarily a technical sound by any means, because again, I'm sure people just at some point in their life probably were able to make that sound or saw someone who did and they learned it real quick. And you could do that all day, just and that's just rolling the muscles of your lips over your teeth and breathing out in sort of like a burst, and then you get them. Well, the tennis pop sound is done the same way. It's just you're opening your mouth and lowering and hollowing your throat out, which we talked about before, and sort of pushing your throat outwards to give your mouth more room to resonate with the sound, which is how you get a... You get that more echoey, deeper version of that. And it's just pushing your throat outwards to give yourself more space for the sound to resonate, which, like we talked about before, the idea of throat hollowing, it ties into quite a few different sounds in beatboxing, and it's not the most intuitive thing to learn. But once you sort of figure it out, just to recap what we talked about before, by pushing your throat outwards and creating more space for sounds to resonate and echo in general, one, like we're talking about here, it gives you the tennis ball sound, or the... We also talked about things like the hollow clops, which is using your tongue to smack the floor of your mouth. And by hollowing your tongue out, you get more of a resounding. And that's a combination of, one, getting the throat hollowing technique, and also building up tongue strength, muscle strength for doing that just smacking downwards motion. And I didn't mention this before because it didn't occur to me, but for those that are trying to learn the clop, you may be tempted to do a slightly different technique, which I think most people probably know better. And it's a standard click, a tongue click. And what that sounds like is... And tongue clicks are done by sealing your tongue against the roof of your mouth and then pulling it down forcefully to get that snap. And again, not restricted to beatboxing. I'm sure people have probably seen that at some point before, where someone's clicking their tongue out, you're just going. That's different from a clop, because a clop doesn't require you to seal your tongue. It's done from your tongue in freestanding neutral position. So instead of coming down from the top of your mouth with that suction force, with that, for the clop, it's just from neutral position, smacking your tongue down against the floor to get the, and then the hollowing of the throat gives you more of the echoey sound for the hollow clop. It's two different, somewhat similar techniques, and the regular standard tongue click is pretty easy. Once you've done that, anyone can do that. But the actual clop motion requires muscle strength, because your tongue's not used to smacking the floor of your mouth, because no one does that. So I did want to point out the distinction between those two techniques. The hollow clop is pretty useful. I don't use it a ton. I need to use it more. But it's the one that requires a lot of muscle training and practice for your tongue in order for you to be able to, one, get an audible sound with the, and two, to be able to do it fast in rapid succession, which is the. So we're talking about the mouth sounds. That's why I wanted to talk a little bit about the tennis pop, because I was using it in the warm-up beat there for the beat I was doing, where I was going. And because it's not a breathing sound, just like a regular pop, it's just mouth pressure. You don't have to breathe in or out in order to do that. Once you sort of get familiar with doing that motion, you can do it in succession as part of a combo, which is how I'm getting two in succession. The only reason why it sounds different in the chain I was doing is because I was changing the position of my mouth to give a different pitch to the tennis ball pop, which is how you get that. I could just do the same one and just do it. But because it's so easy to affect just by how much space or room in your mouth you're giving it, just by dropping the jaw a little bit is how you get a little bit deeper instead of a. But it's still the same sort of hollow sound, which contrasts with the unhollow version of just the. So pops and clops, I've seen them described that way, are kind of simple techniques, but they can fit into patterns really well. So when it comes to beatbox technique and, again, improving your arsenal and toolkit, because it's not too difficult, there's no reason why you wouldn't want to just learn how to get good and consistent with those techniques and just have them at the ready so you can mix up your beats. And since we're on the topic of clicks and things coming from the mouth and or tongue muscles, I guess it'd be good to talk a little bit about the regular clicks. I don't know off the top of my head if the beatbox notation differentiates these types of clicks. So what I mean by that is, we talked about the regular tongue click with the roof of the mouth to the bottom, which is the kind of sounds like a tick-tocking type sound. The other tongue click that I do more often is the one that sounds like. And again, I don't know beatbox notation wise how people differentiate those two, because they're done differently, but using very similar techniques. So again, the regular tongue click, that I think I've seen it referred to as a block click before, but that's done again with the sealing the tongue to your roof of your mouth and pulling it down with force and getting it to snap, which is how you get that. But the other one that I was doing, that's done by putting your tongue into the roof of your mouth, but using the same suction method further back towards the middle or rear part of your tongue. So the front of your tongue is sort of just hanging down, but you're sealing the middle or back part, if that makes sense. And then you're pulling that down with more force. So that's how you get the. And again, I don't know notation-wise if people differentiate the type of click, but it's still considered like a tongue click sound. So I guess it just sort of fills the same category. But I've found that that particular type of click is easier to do quickly. Like if you're talking about the first one, I suppose if you have good muscle memory, you could do it in fairly rapid succession. Like I think the fastest I could do it would probably be like an eighth notes, not super fast. But for the other one with the tongue portion further back, the you can keep your tongue in position and you're just resealing it and repopping it. And so there's less space or room for your tongue to have to move to reset the position. You literally keep your whole tongue in the same position. You're just popping the back part up and down as much as you need to. So that type of click I found is a lot more easy to do quickly once you develop the muscle strength for it. So you've probably heard in a couple of the beats that I've done where I'll do something like the pitch change in the succession of clicks is just mouth position, opening and closing. But the actual speed just comes from practice. Even if you're the type of person who knows how to do that, being able to do it fast and for an extended amount of time is just muscle strength and endurance. And I've seen some beatboxers who do a lot of work with clicks, and the stuff they can do is pretty crazy. I think one that comes to mind would be Wawad. I think he's from France. His click technique is crazy. Another one would be Gene Shinozaki from the States. He's also got insanely fast and clean click patterns. And so when it comes to practicing that, just like a lot of the other repetitive stuff when it comes to conditioning and muscle strength, it's just doing that motion over and over and over again, giving your tongue muscle the ability to build up strength and endurance. So you could sort of sit there all day just doing till your tongue gets tired and you have to stop, and then you reset and you do it again. And by doing that, it builds up the conditioning and it also gets your clicks cleaner. And then by messing around with mouth position and whatnot, it's how you get the different pitches in the sound. So if you're doing that steady run of the, and you just start opening or closing your mouth while you're doing the movement, that's how you get the. I don't know how loud that is on the mic. It should probably not be too close when I'm doing that. But just like the pops and clops, clicks are pretty useful and they don't require air, so they can be worked in between all sorts of different other sounds. And they work pretty good in synergy with a lot of other things in pattern construction. So when it comes to basics and things that people should be focusing on as beginners, don't ignore the more quote-unquote simple sounding sounds, because they can definitely be useful and they're just good to know to give yourself options when it comes to creating patterns. Let's see, let me take a look at my list here. Here's another sound that I don't think I've talked about at all, and I don't even know if I've done it in a pattern. But it's not necessarily a sound so much as what I consider a melodic tool or melody type tool, and that's the trumpet. And the trumpet is a pretty commonly used beatbox sound, and I'll do my best to sort of break down how it works and how to actually apply it. It's going to be a little bit difficult when you can't see an actual human mouth. But to sort of demonstrate what a trumpet sounds like when I do it, a trumpet sounds like and obviously, because it's a melody-driven sound, it can be used for creating a lot of things as part of a routine or pattern where you need to have a melody. And I've seen a couple people break down how to do the trumpet. I've seen one where you sort of use your teeth on top of your tongue, your top teeth on your bottom, or not tongue, your bottom lip, to get kind of a, and that kind of creates a more brassy sounding version of the trumpet. And I think people also can adapt that into more of a saxophone type sound. They're very similar. But I do my trumpet on the side. And the way I do it is by completely sealing my lips and leaving a tiny gap of air on, for me, it's on the left. And it's very small, maybe a millimeter tall gap that all the air is forcing through, and it's just humming. So what does that mean in practice? Again, you can't see what my face is doing, but I have a tiny crack of air in the left side of my face between my lips, and by forcing the air through and humming, by keeping the gap very close together, the lips are actually resonating very slightly and getting a bit of a buzz or reverberation, just kind of like you do when you actually play a real trumpet. And so if I was just completely humming through a space in my mouth without having that tight, gap for it to resonate, it would just sound like, which is just, it's like if I was singing or humming, it'd just be a, and the technique for the trumpet is how you get that sort of forced tiny gap of air for your lips to resonate, and that's how it goes from the to a, and you could play with things like vibrato and other things with the tone to give it more of a sort of instrument sounding sound. To me, it sounds more brassy because of that slight resonation you're getting on your lips, and then your ability to play notes is just pretty much based on your ability to sing. And so it's pretty useful. I like the trumpet a lot. It's one of the only melody type sounds I know. I just sometimes forget I know it, and I don't put it into patterns enough. But it's definitely handy when you want to work with actual melodies, and if you're doing a cover or something else and you needed a way to actually do melodic parts of your patterns. And the trumpet is really good for that. A lot of it's just sort of figuring out the best technique and how to make the technique work for you to get that sound. But I would recommend just looking for tutorials on how the different mouth positions look. That way you can see what works for you and adapt that into your own version of the trumpet. I think mine is a little bit more muted than the teeth trumpet. So mine ends up sounding more like a flugelhorn or a cornet instead of like a regular brass trumpet. But it's still pretty useful. All right. So we've talked a little bit about some basic sounds. I think I want to go back to pattern practice. There's some other stuff that I want to hit on a little bit later, but I want to do some more practice before my voice starts to get tired, and also start working on some bass integration, since I tend to put that off until later on in the jam stream. And as my voice gets more and more tired, it gets more difficult for me to do my different basses consistently. And outside of streams, I've been trying to drill and practice my different basses so that I get more endurance and I'll be able to sustain for longer and not have to worry about my voice dying 1 hour into a 2 or 3 hour jam stream. So I am working on that. But I also have honey here too. If I need to, I'll grab some of that. So as part of the drills and practice, I'm going to incorporate some throat and probably vocalized chest bass. And let's work on some practice patterns now that I feel like my face is pretty warmed up, especially after talking through all that other stuff. So let's go back to pattern practice. So what we did in that particular just real simple set of what I consider bass drills is getting the sustained throat bass, the and working that in between different combinations of hats and snares and tempos. And like I mentioned in some of the previous streams, part of the challenge of using any of the throat and or chest basses isn't necessarily getting the technique to come out. Getting the technique to come out and be clean is just repetitive practice over and over again, and getting your throat and throat parts conditioned to making those particular sounds. The actual challenge, at least for me in learning, comes from changing notes and moving quickly between the different notes in your bass line. Because when you start dealing with things that are faster paced or a higher tempo, it gives you less time to sort of react, and your voice, or however you're making your bass sounds, if it's the throat bass with the, you have to be able to change between your notes quickly, and you have to be used to doing that because you're not just used to a slow, sustained change in your bass line. And that's a big challenge, especially going from high notes to low notes. And so one drill that I've seen recommended for any type of bass, whether it's throat or vocalized chest or probably even inward, which I can't do, would be practicing the extreme ends of your bass range, extreme ends of your range, and learning how to go from a real high one to a low one and back and forth so that your voice gets used to that change. So if we were to put that into practice, what would that sound like? All right, so if we're talking about throat bass, again, we start up my bass note for throat bass tends to be kind of in the middle. It's not super low, it's not super high, it's just a. If we go to the high end of the range, I think the highest throat bass note I can do is probably a. And I haven't studied music in forever, so forgive me for not giving you the note names. But the highest note's probably around there, and the lowest throat bass note, if I drop it down, is probably. So you have a. And so the drill for practicing moving between your notes easily would be going from probably high to low, maybe to the middle, high, low, middle, something like that. And just doing that over and over again so your voice is used to moving between the different parts of the bass line, and you build up sort of that conditioning. For vocalized chest bass, which gets harder and harder for me to do after I've been talking for a while. The vocalized chest bass, and it could be my mic is causing me to have my head tilted down too low for me to do that easily. Let me try and fix that. So vocalized chest bass, if we compare it to the or just the regular throat bass, and we drop it for a vocalized chest, would be whoa, 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 whoa. Oh yeah, that mic position works way better. I think I was tilting my head down too far. Whoa, 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 whoa. And so for me, I use vocalized chest bass for being able to hit lower bass tones. If you really push it and learn how to develop technique, you can learn how to get even lower, and it'll be sort of in the range of something like an inwards bass. But that's the idea of moving between high notes and low notes is still the same. So if we go from regular throat bass to chest bass, we're dropping from or even higher. And so that's a good drill to sort of get in the habit of working into your practice, just to give you exposure and condition your throat muscles to be able to change things on the fly. And obviously, this is probably something I should have mentioned in one of the earlier jam streams, but it's really important when it comes to beatbox practice. And that's especially when you're working on basses, if your voice starts to get tired or your throat gets sore and painful, then take a break. Some of the more strenuous things, especially inwards bass, throat bass in the beginning can kind of wear on your vocal cords a little, especially if you do it for a really long time. But inwards specifically, since it tends to hit lower in your throat, that can really mess with your voice and do damage if you're not careful. So whenever you're practicing, and it really applies to any sort of sound, but basses specifically, if you start getting throat pain and it's hard to talk and whatnot, just take a break, maybe for a few hours, or even take a day, come back the next day after your throat's had a chance to rest, and then pick up your practicing. Because if you push it and you keep pushing your throat when it's already starting to get sore and it's getting sort of raw, you could do much more long-term damage. And it's much better to just rest, recover, and let your endurance build over time, because it will build over time as your throat gets conditioned to doing different sounds, specifically basses we're talking about here. Then the more you do that consistently and again rest, it will build up that endurance, and you'll be able to practice for longer. You'll be able to do sounds for longer, and that's pretty important. I remember one of the first throat type mechanical bass I learned, like I mentioned towards the beginning, was throat bass. And when I first started doing it, it wasn't clean because my voice isn't used to doing, and especially it's not used to doing that for a long time in succession. And so I couldn't sit there when I was learning throat bass and just immediately go from just a to like a no, I couldn't do anything like that. I couldn't even move between notes easily, and that's because my throat wasn't conditioned to making that noise. So it was just a matter of practicing, backing off when my throat started to get sore and I couldn't talk, and then drinking water and resting, and then coming back and then continuing to drill, work up to your limit, and then rest. And then over time, your ability to do that for longer improves. All right, let's take a look at the list again here. Before we move on to technicality, which I do want to spend some time just drilling and practicing technical patterns and thinking about ideas for new ones, Another sound that I haven't talked about yet, it's on my list, and I'm looking at it right now, so I'm going to talk about it here before we sort of transition in the next part of the jam stream. And it's actually another snare, and it's a snare I don't use very often. And I know when I was talking to Kindo a long time ago, he told me that it's actually a really good snare to spend time practicing and working towards mastery on, just because it's done differently than the others. And that's the pest snare. So what does the pest snare sound like? If you compare to the standard outwards snares like a PF, the or an outwards K, like a pest sounds like, and mine isn't very good. It's why it doesn't sound particularly impactful, but it's basically an inwards mouth snare. It's not quite as punchy as a PF, but it's done by sealing your lips and then breathing in and then popping them to get the. So that's a bit more punchy. Again, my pest snare is not good. I don't use it very often. But what Kindo was talking about that I thought was interesting that I hadn't even considered is how you could use that particular inward sound in conjunction with technicality patterns. And I think that's definitely valid and a good reason to work on the pest snare. One, because it's not mechanically that difficult to do. It's difficult to get clean, obviously, because I can't do it cleanly. But because a lot of technicality sounds are playing with either a combination of inwards or outwards motions, having something that's going to put your lips into position for something else is good, and the pest snare is good for that. So I do sort of regret not really paying attention to that particular one. It's on my list of things to practice. In fact, I have it coded as practicing, just like I do with the cough snare. But for those that are looking for a little more information, you can look up tutorials on the pest snare to see how people set their mouth position for it. But it is a good one and a handy one to have in the arsenal. And because we're talking a little bit about technique, one thing I wanted to hit on a little bit as far as talking about analysis of beatbox technique, I can't remember if I covered this at length in the previous jam streams. Maybe I touched on it a little bit when we were talking about some of the sounds, but I wanted to talk a little bit about the importance of efficient mouth position and using that to build your patterns when it comes to putting sounds together. So what does that mean? What that means is keeping mentally a map of, if you were to think about your mouth as a diagram, where the different sounds that you're using come from. And this is probably going to be a bit more related to technicality pattern construction than things like basses. But for non-bass type sounds in patterns and combos, being mindful of where they start and stop gives you a pretty good way to set up how to chain different sounds together and make them flow. And the best way to illustrate that, I think, would be probably looking at the sound that I covered, I believe it was last time, the zip snare or zip hat. And I think I talked about it when we were talking about that particular sound. But to illustrate what I'm talking about when it comes to mouth position and efficiency, if we take the zip sound that at least the way I use it, and take note of the fact that when the is done, your lips are closed and together. So if you're using it in conjunction with other sounds, if you chain the into something that uses that closed mouth position, it'll be easy to do because your mouth is already set. It's set up to be able to do that, and you don't have to reset and reposition everything. And I think when we were talking about the zip snare, I said one of the things I like to do is chain the straight into the BMG or spit snare, or because the and come or end in the same spot. So the ends where the starts, if that makes sense. So that makes it really easy to do something like a And that's even using the zip KB, zip kick pattern. I'm not on my pattern tab right now, but that's how you go from the, and you can even train that into a BMG if you want to have multiple snares in the line. You do something like, do something kind of funky like that. But the idea of taking advantage of mouth position will help with pattern construction because you're sort of thinking ahead to say, all right, if I know my lips are going to be, or my mouth position is going to be here, what makes sense as far as sounds to tack onto that are going to be easy? Because you can really put beatboxing sounds together in any order. It's going to be harder for some than others. And I mean, some sounds to combo into others because they might be different positions. Like you could combo a BMG snare into a click, but the positions aren't really that close together. So how would that sound like? You do something like, you could do something like that, but you can't do it quickly because the and the are completely different positions. One is a lip position, the other one is a tongue position. So the experimentation part of beatboxing and pattern construction is being mindful of where the sounds start and stop and where similar sounds start and stop and coming up with something that sort of flows. And a lot of that comes from just playing around, trial and error, as you build out your sound catalog and say, okay, I know all these sounds. How do I want to put them together? And it's pretty freeform, which is nice. I think that the flexibility to adapt different combinations of sounds and pretty much an infinite amount of permutations is what makes beatboxing so interesting. And it's why beatboxers all have their own signature styles. I think it's pretty safe to say that for people out there in the field, and especially at the pro level, no two beatboxers sound identical as far as style. Some may use similar techniques or similar basses, and they may have different elements of their sound that are similar, but you can't say that one beatboxer is a carbon copy of another, because one, everybody learns differently, and two, everyone has different preferences as far as styles and themes that they sort of gravitate towards, which is pretty neat. I'm still trying to figure out what my style is. I don't know right now. Let's see. I think we are almost done with sound analysis. One final sound for now that I wanted to talk about here, since I haven't mentioned it on any of the jam streams so far, and to be 100% transparent, it's a sound I'm not great at. I've been practicing it and drilling it more recently, but I'm not good at utilizing it in patterns and putting it into combos yet. It's something I'm working on. But the sound itself is called an inwards click roll. And an inwards click roll sounds like, it's considered a bass sound, I think, because it's not a technicality sound, and it's not something like a kick or a snare. But that kind of low, and depending on how you're adapting the inwards click roll, you can sort of play around in mouth position, and I will break down how it works in a minute here, as best I can. But on a mic, worked into a pattern and used properly, the hits fairly hard, and it's pretty noticeable as far as providing that sort of punch, especially for drops. And it's a useful technique. It's just mechanically a little bit weird compared to the other ones. So I'm going to break down real quickly. Again, this isn't necessarily meant to be an in-depth tutorial, but the way I do the inward click roll is in the middle of my mouth. And interestingly enough, this last week, a really well-known beatboxer out there in the pro scene, in fact, he was last year's Grand Beatbox champion, this guy from the UK named D-Lo, an insanely talented beatboxer and one of my favorites. He put up a tutorial on his channel about how to do the inwards click roll. And he broke it down in a way that's different from the way I learned it. But for those that are curious about learning the click roll, definitely check out his tutorial, because it seems like depending on how your mouth works, some techniques or methods to create the sound may be better for some people than others. And I sort of brute forced it and figuring out how to do it myself. And I tried using his method, and because my muscle memory is used to doing it in the middle where I learned, it was a little bit difficult. But for resources, definitely check out Delo's inward click roll tutorial. It's pretty good. But for how I do it, one, the inward click roll, as the name would suggest, is an inward breathing sound. It's not a mouth pressure sound, and it's not a pure muscle-based sound. And so the way I do the inward click roll is by taking my tongue and putting the tip to the roof of my mouth, and then forcing air in over my tongue, causing it to vibrate. It's essentially the reverse of tongue bass. And we talked about tongue bass before, which is forcing the air out and causing your tongue to flap when the air goes over it, just like rolling your tongue, which is how you get the... Inwards click roll is very similar to that, but your tongue is bent inwards in a way on the roof of your mouth, and you're breathing air inwards and getting it to flap that way. So it's a little bit backwards from just the... And that's how you get there. But I'll tell you, the mechanics of doing that for me, like some of the other sounds, like the lip roll, I don't know what it is about inward sounds, but inward sounds just take longer for me to get. But the inward click roll, I just had to mess around with mouth position and tongue position specifically in order to get them. And again, it's one of my practicing sounds right now. I'm actually been drilling it a lot more recently because I want to start using it in patterns. Because once you get sort of good at hitting the position real quickly and setting for the mouth position, you can use it like an inward drag. And I'm not going to demonstrate that because I can't really do it effectively. But if we think of something like a dubstep pattern with an inward drag, and do something like a... something like that, if you take the... and switch it out for the... you can do that, since they're both the same type of inward sound, just a different mouth position. But my challenge is resetting from a to a, and I know there's probably a mid step that I'm missing somewhere as far as how to set the mouth position in and out of a inward click drag pattern like that. But some of the folks out there that are really good at it have perfected the art of working that inward click roll into a inward click roll drag, like I mentioned, and using that as part of their patterns, and it sounds really cool. Two folks that I recommend checking out for that would be Trung Bao from Vietnam and his girlfriend Chihuahua from Poland. I think she's from Poland. Those two have really good utilization of click roll drags, and like their construction for things like drops and really heavy beats are incredibly impressive. When we eventually get down the road and we do beatbox media shares, I'm going to be throwing some clips from both of those two in the mix, because they're really, really proficient, and they're a lot of fun to listen to. So as far as click roll, I'm going to be working on it more, and as I sort of get better at the positioning and learning how to combo the sound into other sounds, I will start working that into pattern practice here. So you guys will probably see that at some point once I get better at it. But as far as heavy techniques and sort of that punchy bass for things like drops and electronic type of beat sounds, yeah, inward click roll is very useful. It's a cool technique. It's just a challenge to learn and a challenge to get good at. All right. Proceeding on, I did want to spend some time working on technicality drills and coming up with some brainstorming ideas for technicality patterns. I think long term, one of my goals is to come up with some more varied technicality patterns to work into routines to sort of give more of a set of options when it comes to filling in parts of beats and also just to build proficiency with speed. Again, I would not consider myself a fast, high speed beatboxer. The folks out there that have been doing this much longer than me, that have done a lot of work with technicality, are capable of doing some really, really impressive stuff. Of note, one guy who I think I mentioned before is a beatboxer from Russia named Helium. His technicality is insane, and he put out a video recently which was like 18 different types of drum and bass technicality patterns. I really want to show that on stream sometime because one, he writes out the notation, and two, it's just him doing the pattern over and over again in front of the camera with the notation so people can learn. And the stuff he does is crazy. He has a case snare type sound, which is a little different from just like a regular inwards K, like a, and it's different from a rim shot or a. It's like in between those two, and it's kind of unique to his style. But yeah, that guy's a monster when it comes to technicality, and he's insane at inward bass too. But like we've talked about on previous jam streams, the idea of technicality and putting together basic sounds in fast patterns to use in between other parts of your pattern construction is definitely something that's requires a lot of practice and a lot of experimentation. So we talked about on a couple streams now the standard set of technicality patterns that I use, the TKP or KPT. So like the TKP is the, and the KPT is just the inverse of that, which sounds somewhat similar, or the KOPT, which sounds like, and I'm still working on the combined six sound chain that puts those two together. So it would be the TKP, KPT, which would be, and I'm still working on getting that into a workable state, but it still sounds relatively similar to the extended chains of just both those two. So I feel like being able to do that's going to give me some options, but it's not really going to be a big change when it comes to the overall technicality patterns being used. It's just going to be kind of a variant. But another one that I mentioned before that I've been putting a little more emphasis on in practice, and I want to continue to get better at because it's going to open up a lot of possibilities, is the real simple elementary TKK, which is usually what people learn when it comes to technicality patterns. It's one of the first they teach. And to recap what we talked about before, the TKK is just a T hat sound, a and a K sound, not a full outwards K snare, but just a K sound. And the final K or capital K is the rim shot, or the. So the three sounds in succession go, and it's a triplet pattern, and the TKK is used in high speed beats like I mentioned before, but the challenge comes from getting good and clean at doing each of the three sounds in succession and then slowly building up speed over time. And so I've been trying to drill a little bit more since it's a pattern I don't use super frequently, but my goal is to build up enough speed where I can do it rapid fire, and I can't quite do it yet. My TKK speed now, as of today, it's up to about it starts to lose its cleanliness towards the end, but I still need to work on getting it faster and a bit more streamlined and then definitely cleaner sounding. So the end goal is to be able to do it even quicker than that, but until then it's just practicing the same three over and over again as much as possible, and then repeating over and over again, just the. It's coming along. It's not quite there yet. It's considered a work in progress. Real quick, I forgot to update the sound status. I'm going to do technicality / patterns. I said I was going to do it more consistently for a stream, and I immediately just didn't do it. Yeah, I'm going to keep drilling TKK and checking in when we get ready to do these practice sessions, just to sort of chronicle the development of the sound as it goes. Hopefully between now and, let's say, 6 months from now, I'll have sort of mastered the TKK a little bit better. Because for me, my fastest set of sounds is still the TKP or KPT. Because if we're comparing the two, my fastest TKK pattern is something like, my fastest KPT string sounds like, it's very clear that I've practiced one more than the other, which is the case. So I'll be having to focus on drilling everything, really. I do think it's going to be possible to get the TKP and KPT even faster, and so I'm going to continue to drill those as well. But if we're talking about technicality patterns and potential ideas, I think the best thing to do, I'm mentally trying to think of how to tackle it for the stream here. I think I'm going to just do some practice beats and then try and do as many variations on the technicality patterns as I can think of, and then just try and switch between different beats rapidly and sort of get the practice of doing that on the fly. So I think I'll do that for a little bit, and then we'll sort of see where we're at as far as time goes. All right, so let's see. We'll start off a little bit slow. Let me move my mic here. Switch the tempo up a little bit. My tongue was getting numb towards the end of that. As I was sort of just messing around with the beats there, what I was switching in as far as the technicality patterns was a mix of triple kicks, the FT snare, and sort of sandwiching that in between the TKP or KPT patterns, which is how you're getting things like the And what I've found is, at least in sustained practice sessions, the longer I do those, the more numb my mouth gets, and then I start to lose the cleanliness, and it starts to get a little more messy and sloppy. So the end goal of the drills and practice would be to do that more and more, so that my mouth is used to doing that combination of sounds for longer, and I'm not losing that sort of crispness or cleanliness to the different beats. And like I've mentioned on previous streams, when you're trying to break down any sort of sound and you're trying to improve it, if you go back and sort of slow things down and work on each individual component sound and then work your way back up to speed, that's going to ultimately result in you having a cleaner pattern than trying to brute force it and go for just speed out the gates, especially when you're still learning. So if we take that into practice here, and we're looking at the string that was going, so BTB, FT, FTKP, B, I think. I'm not good at notation, but the even just repeating that section of sounds and pattern in a pattern is going to improve it in the long run. So that's what I wanted to do as part of the exercise here. So if we start real slow, the and then ultimately, if we try and do it fast, you go from to the still not clean. It needs more work. So I'll have to, I think I have that on the list, but I'll have to remember that pattern is one that needs to be practiced. Let's see, we can practice some inwards technicality patterns. I need to work on my sucker punch drag combination of sounds in order just to practice. So if we go back to the beats, I'm going to switch things up a little bit, and we'll work on inwards technicality for a little bit here. So what does that sound like? What I did at the end there is I switched from the to the. Need to figure out some more uses for that inwards F technicality pattern. Maybe it's because I'm not that good with it yet, but I feel like it could be faster. The fastest I can do that triplet pattern is. Yeah, I think that's just going to be practice. That set of motions is a little bit unusual. I'm not used to it, but definitely needs a bit more drilling to get clean. And the other one, the main sucker punch drag that I was doing, I feel like I'm hitting a plateau as far as speed goes on that one. I think it can be faster. I'm just going to need to drill it a little bit more to get speed and consistency, because I think it can go faster than just a. But I think because it's a mix of tongue sounds and inward breathing, it's a little bit more difficult for the muscle memory to get faster. But we'll see. The other variation, I think I demoed this last time when I talked about the sucker punch drag, takes the and it adds a couple sounds on the end for a sustained set of sounds. So instead of back to back, you get a, which can be useful for doing just filler or doing a drawn out single set of technicality sounds in between beats. And so I think I've done that a couple times. It'd be something like a, that's a really good one for breathing in. It's a constant stream of air inwards, but because your tongue is making all the different sounds in between, it's kind of a metered intake of air, and so you're not getting flooded all at once. And if you're just breathing in just all at once, because you're sort of filtering it as you go in, it's a lot slower, so you can get a gradual bit of air intake, which is kind of useful. I never thought about that with that particular set of patterns. But that one tends to work pretty good on mid-tempo or kind of like a dubstep type beat. Not necessarily for a drop, but just as a filler, because you get that four sounds versus the yeah. So it's a four note pattern instead of a 3, which is with the yeah. Okay, I never thought of it that way. I should probably write that down so I can distinguish that on my list. Inward sound, sucker punch drag. 3x, 4x sustain. So in practice, if we were doing something like a dubstep beat, that's how you get the and yeah, if you're switching up back to triples, that's where you do that there. And the triples, I guess I'm fast enough that I could do it sort of just in between, but it's not as clean as I would like it. If you compare the triplet for the sucker punch drag to the triplet for the TKP in a similar type of beat as just a filler. So what I mean by that would be if you were doing something like a and the is essentially kind of condensed into one really, really fast triplet in between, compared to the TKP, which would be well, I feel like the sucker punch drag flows a little bit better, probably because the TKP ends with a sound similar to a kick. I'm assuming that's why it sounds like there's an extra kick in there from the. But another technicality pattern, which I don't think I talked about before, in fact, I've probably done it and never mentioned it, is a PF snare TKP roll or string, a repeated string. So what does that sound like? You have the PF snare, the and then TKP, the. So it's PF, TKP, and then repeated. And so that sounds like. And that works pretty well as a build up to a drop, I've found. So how we put that into practice in a sample beat? If we're doing kind of a dubstep build up, we're doing something like a and then we go into our drop. That one took a little bit of practice, but the muscle memory for that one, because the PF, even though it doesn't end in a similar position to the TKP, because the TKP is an open mouth set of sounds, because there's each one is so quick, it's easy to reset. Your mouth isn't having to change its shape dramatically, which is probably why it's fairly easy to chain the into the to get a. And I can't remember off the top of my head if I've seen that particular type of combo used a lot. I'm sure people have thought about it and done it. I've probably just never seen it. But when it comes to utilizing the combination of sounds, I'm sure you could do PF KPT the same way. What would that sound like? Oh, well, my mouth doesn't like that position at all. That feels a lot less natural than the other one. Maybe it's because I am not used to doing it, but I feel like my mouth has to reset to get from to, even though they're close. Versus, yeah, they actually just end up sounding almost the same. If I had a choice, I would probably just do the PF TKP and stick with that because I can do it cleaner. Because if I tried to do it the other way with the KPT, it wouldn't sound too much different, but it would definitely sound messier. But that's another good option to have in the toolkit. I like the idea of chaining snares into simple 1 or 2 note technicality patterns, which is how you got the outward K zip kick. Remember my own notation here. Yeah. Kick, outward K, kick zip, K zip kick. That's what I meant to say. K zip kick. And I don't know if I talked about this when I was giving the overview about that particular pattern last time, but one thing I was just doing subconsciously there was the K zip kick into zip double kick, zip triple kick, zip triple, which was a. So it was the K zip triple or K zip single. That's the difference. The single would be the, and the K zip triple is the one I was just doing then. That one is definitely not as clean. I gotta practice that one. I'm adding that to the list. KZ lowercase p VTB. Yeah, more practice necessary on that one. All right, let's take a look at the technicality list here. I know I've done it a couple times in just basic patterns in practice, but the variations on the the FTKP that we were doing earlier, the for a while before I learned the rim shot for sure, I was doing that chain into just a regular outwards K, and that sounds like the problem with doing that, and I think that's why you don't see a regular outward K used in Technicality that much, is it's difficult to get that fast and it's difficult to chain. If we were to try and do that back to back and do it in speed, I think the fastest I could get would be something like it's definitely not clean, but the outwards K sort of stops the momentum, and it's more like a rest in between. So that's probably why you don't see that in a lot of patterns, at least none that I've seen. I could be wrong. But we'll have to do more work with the use of the rim shot in things because it's much faster than the regular outwards K. It doesn't require as much movement in the mouth, and it can sort of set its position better, which is why it's part of the widely used TKK, because from to it's just tongue positioned by maybe like a quarter of an inch and resetting. But I'll have to think about that between now and the next jam stream, and I don't know when I'm going to do another one of these, maybe in a couple weeks or so. I'm going to think about some ideas for new patterns, new Technicality patterns, and then I'm going to bring them to the jam session so we can practice them and talk about them here. I'll have to do some research and think about some other things I want to talk about for the next one. I have been practicing inward bass. I can't do it. I'm not going to torture people with my attempts to do it here on stream yet. But as soon as I can get an actually consistent bass sound inwards, then I'm going to start working that into practice here so that we can drill that. And that's going to be an uphill climb, I can tell. It's probably one of the toughest sounds I've ever tried to learn. But it's very useful and very handy for a lot of different types of sound. So my goal for 2021, we're here in June, as of today, middle of June. My goal for 2021 is to get inward bass. We'll see if that actually happens. I'm also working on another one I haven't talked about yet, but I'm going to save that for future streams, since I think that one's closer to being stream ready, as it were. But that'll be a topic of conversation for another time. Take a look at the sound list and what we've covered so far in the session today. I kind of jumped around a little bit more than usual. I may need to structure my topics of discussion for these a little bit better next time. But we started with some overviews of basics like we always do. We talked about breathing and the importance of air control when it comes to beatbox sounds. I went over some sound technique analysis for things that we hadn't talked about before. Things like your pops, and it's in conjunction with clops, or your and clicks, or we talked a little bit about the inward click roll, which was a new topic here, and an ongoing sound for me, and that's the for Technicality. We didn't really learn anything new, but we did practice a little bit with some stuff that we were already working on. I think I will probably be watching back the footage of this particular stream archive and making some notes on things to make sure I include on the list for ongoing learning. And then keep in mind how I want to structure the lesson next time. Oh yeah, we talked about the trumpet. We talked about how to do the and that was the first sort of melodic sound that we've covered here in the jam stream. Another sound that I can't do, even though it's considered one of the beginner basic sounds, is the basic synth. I've been trying to learn that one in addition to some of the other stuff I'm working on now. So it's not stream ready, as it were. But I do need to make it more of a point to integrate some more melodic or melody driven sounds into the arsenal so that when I'm putting together patterns and beats and eventually routines, I can start working on some of that stuff. And that's in addition to all of the bass work and everything else. But basic synths are not difficult, but I'm still learning. So once I get a handle on that, and I'll bring it to the jam stream here, and we can talk about technique and how to fit it into patterns. So as far as sound overview goes, that's what we covered today. And our technicality practice, we didn't drill as much as I would have thought I was going to. It was kind of more of a discussion on experimenting and seeing what can be done with the existing sounds in the arsenal. Depending on how the stream plans pan out over the next couple weeks, I do want to do a beatbox media share stream where I basically present videos. This will be on YouTube or off of YouTube, where I present videos that I've curated into a playlist about beatboxing content in order to share it with you guys on stream and sort of show you what the scene looks like and what's out there. I haven't got an ETA on that yet. I may wait until we get a few more people that are hanging around for these jam streams, and it'd be a good discussion, especially if folks just are learning and trying to get into beatboxing. But that's definitely something I want to do. In fact, the first media share stream I eventually do, whether it's a month from now or 2 months from now or whatnot, the first one I'm thinking is going to be beatbox related. And that'll give me some time in between now and then to start putting together a playlist and adding videos that I want to cover so that when we actually sit down to do that, there'll be a good list of content from the professional side, and maybe I'll work some tutorials in there too. I think it would be good to present some of the folks that are out there in the community doing tutorials for people who want to learn. Again, folks like Kindo from the States, Tyler W from the States, Rubik from Canada, Dilo from the UK. There's a lot of people out there that are doing tutorials. So I'll either think of a way to work that into the material for a media share, or I may do a dedicated tutorial media share stream separately, where anyone who wants to learn beatboxing or learn about basics can tune into that specifically, and then we'll go through it from the top. And I know I've tuned in a couple times to Prince Lemon's YouTube streams. He's the guy I mentioned a couple ago that was doing beatbox tutorial streams. And Prince Lemon, he just finished a 24-hour one last week, which was pretty nuts. But he told me that he's planning on doing another beatbox tutorial stream for all of his folks. So if I get advance notice about when that's going to be, I'll put it out on Twitter. That way, get some signal boosting for his content. And as long as I'm not stuck doing something else or I'm not at work, when he actually goes live doing that, I'll try and jump on his stream so that I can sit in and listen to the material he's going to cover. But that being said, I think we've covered everything I wanted to cover on today's jam stream. think this one was a little bit more on the discussion heavy side than straight beatboxing. I will have to think about how I want to switch up things next time. One, from a content perspective and what I want to cover, but also how much I want to balance the explanation and talking about stuff versus just doing straight practice and drills. So I'll give that some thought. Another thing I've considered doing, and those of you guys that are watching on stream now, and those of you guys that are watching this in the archives later, let me know what you think about the idea of me doing like really short clips. I know YouTube has a shorts feature, and Twitter, I don't think they have a dedicated thing. You just upload videos. But I was thinking about doing just short clips of me doing beatbox patterns or putting out ideas that I may have. Like maybe a real quick, just 30-second routine or pattern of me doing something and putting it out there. If that's something you guys would like to see as far as regular content, let me know either on here or on Twitter. And let me know if that's something you guys want to see and that's something I can think about, because I was already considering doing something like that. One, so I don't forget all of the different ideas that I come up with, and two, just to sort of put stuff out there that people can check out if they want. You know, if they don't care about beatboxing, then that's perfectly fine. That's not the only thing I cover here on the YouTube channel. But maybe I can put up a poll. Can I do polls? I don't think I can do community polls because I don't have enough people. We'll see. I'm just going to throw that out there, and if people are interested, just give me a shout. But that being said, I think we'll wrap up the jam stream for today. I've got some homework to do as far as planning the next one. I think we are going to probably shift to gaming for the next week. I think there's 2 more gaming streams this week, and then the following week, I haven't decided on what I want to do yet. I'd like to get back together and do another chill stream, another chatting stream. There's some stuff I wanted to talk about. I know I've been sort of putting off the anime discussion since I know there's some folks on the channel here that do watch anime. So I may do that as the next topic for the chatting stream. Sit down and talk about series I've watched since when I was in Earth School. Was when I watched the most anime. I watched a ton of stuff that was being brought over. I don't get a chance to watch as much stuff now, so it'll sort of be a mix of stuff from back in the day that I watched and that I would recommend, and then the discussion about stuff that's current that people might be watching or that I might be watching. So we'll see. I do want to do that for a chatting stream in the near future. We'll sort of see what pans out, and then I'll put that in the schedule. But that being said, we will go ahead and wrap up. Once again, I want to thank everybody that popped by and just hung out or watched. I know these jam streams are a little more niche as far as VTuber content, but it's something I definitely want to keep doing because beatboxing is something I'm very passionate about. So I appreciate you guys coming along for the ride, and I will see you guys on the next stream. Have a good evening.